really, really challenging for people. So let's say you're from Jerusalem. Now, East Jerusalem is filled with Palestinians, but it's under annexation of Israel. So the Jerusalemites, if you're a Jerusalemite and you want to go to college, you're probably going to go to college in Ramallah, which is inside the West Bank. So let's say you're a college student, you go to Ramallah and you're a young man from Jerusalem, your family's in Jerusalem, your parents, and you meet a nice girl in Ramallah and she's from, let's say, Bethlehem. And you fall in love and you want to marry her. Well, even though the cities are really close to one another, everybody's in fairly close proximity, this young girl from Bethlehem is not able to move with you to Jerusalem. It's not allowed. Your only option is to move into Bethlehem or anywhere else in the West Bank with her because she's not allowed into Jerusalem. Even though East Jerusalem is technically, according to international law, it belongs to the Palestinians. The Israelis have annexed it and they control it and they don't allow Palestinians to immigrate into it, but they do let you leave. So this young man would have to move into the West Bank. If he does this, he loses his Jerusalemite identification, which means he loses his freedom of movement. So then, right now, as a Jerusalemite, he's able to travel anywhere in Israel, anywhere in Jerusalem, anywhere in the West Bank, and he can fly out of Tel Aviv. However, once he decides to move to Bethlehem or Ramallah or wherever with this young girl, he gives all that up, including his ability to visit his own parents. This is where it creates family separation. Now this young man has to decide between his parents, who are inevitably going to age and need his help, or the love of his life, who he wants to make a family with. And this is a very common issue with Palestinians living in that region. So if he leaves and he goes, then the only way he can see his parents are if his parents travel into the West Bank to visit. But he's not allowed to go back into Jerusalem to see his own home, to visit his own childhood, neighborhood, and to see his own parents without special permission. So if he leaves and gives up his Jerusalemite identification and gets the green ID rather than the blue ID, he's going to have to ask the Israelis for special permission to visit his own home that he was born and raised and to visit his own parents. This creates immense strife, immense confusion and complication for the Palestinians. And it's by design. The idea really is that the Israelis have a desire to completely overtake Jerusalem and they'd rather the Palestinians leave. It kind of makes it to where many Palestinians living in Jerusalem, when some of their family members have to move and live outside of Jerusalem, it makes many of them say, you know what, life's just easier if we move along with them. So it gets those older people out of Jerusalem and into the West Bank so that their homes can then be sold to others to take over, so to Israelis for them to take over the region. That is really the purpose of it. So this creates a lot of issues and a lot of strife. Now, people that are living in the West Bank with the green passport, with the green identification, so the passports is where things get really tricky too. Most people living in the West Bank are issued Jordanian passports. So the country of Jordan will give Palestinians a temporary passport from their nation in order to allow the Palestinians to travel throughout the world. The reason is because Palestinians, they're greatly helped by the Jordanians, but also they use the Jordanian airport to get in and out. They're not allowed into Tel Aviv. They've got to go through to Jordan. This creates a huge amount of complication for them to travel out of the country because they've got to go through Palestinian border control. They got to go through Israeli border control because the Israelis control the border. Even though the West Bank borders Jordan, the Israelis actually control that border. So they got to go through first the Palestinians, which is fairly simple for them. Then they got to go through the Israelis, which is not so simple. And then they got to go through Jordan, through their border security, which is fairly normal. So it takes a person who wants to travel out of the Jordan airport, which should only take a couple of hours. It takes something like 12 hours to 14 hours to get in and out of that airport. So those who carry the green, they're only allowed to fly out of Jordan. They're not allowed to fly out of Tel Aviv. Those who carry the blue are able to fly out of Tel Aviv. But the problem is with those who are the Jerusalemites. So they have freedom of movement all throughout Israel, all throughout the West Bank. They can pretty much go anywhere, but it gets really complicated when they want to leave the country. because they're not under the Palestinian Authority, which has the deal with the Jordanian government to give them Jordanian passports, but they're also not Israeli citizens. They're actually given Israeli permanent residency in Jerusalem. So imagine this, you were born and raised and your family goes back hundreds and hundreds of years. Your family's lineage has been in Jerusalem forever and ever and ever. And meanwhile, you're not considered a citizen of any nation. You're stateless. You're actually considered just a permanent resident, and you're given essentially a green card to live in where your family has been for hundreds of years. So their lives are a little bit more complicated when they want to leave the country because they're not issued. Some of them are issued Jordanian passports, so they do end up working with the Palestinian Authority and with the Jordanian government in order to be issued a Jordanian passport. Some of them do attempt and are granted Israeli citizenship, so not many. Last year, I believe that the Israelis did grant citizenship to about 1,400 East Jerusalemites, but many are rejected, and it leaves these stateless people in this sort of limbo when they want to leave the country. A lot of them are granted sort of travel documents. They're not issued passports. They have to go through then kind of like a rigmarole when they want to go and travel to, let's say, England or Germany or the United States, and they have to get permission from that country in order to get in without the passport with this kind of weird travel document. And a lot of times those countries find them threatening because they're like, yeah, but you're stateless, so you might come here seeking asylum, which is a problem for us. We don't really want all these asylum seekers from Jerusalem. And so it creates this confusion, this extra layer of hassle for these Jerusalemites who are just trying to travel the world. So that is the complicated and intricate identification system. Now, the most important thing to note is that it is required of every Palestinian to carry around this identification at all times. They cannot be caught without their ID indicating that they are Palestinian and what kind of Palestinian and where does this Palestinian belong. They must have this identification at all times. Let that sink in for just a second. So that is a general overview of this complicated system. It's actually a bit more complicated. There's more layers to it. There are Jewish Palestinians living in the West Bank that are they're Palestinian descent, but they live in the West Bank, but they happen to be Jewish in religion. So there's some complication there. There's also complication for American citizens who are trying to immigrate into the West Bank and build up the West Bank. These are Americans who maybe immigrated they're Palestinians who maybe immigrated to the United States in the 60s, and they tried to come back during the Oslo Accords to help build up the country. Or it's the children of those people, and they're there running businesses. They're under a very complicated identification system as well, where their travel is also limited once the Israelis find out that they're Palestinian descent living in the West Bank. Even though they're Americans, even though they're paying tax dollars to the Israelis, they're still restricted. They're given a visa that says Judea and Samaria only, meaning they're not allowed to travel into even Jerusalem or into Israel. They're not allowed to go anywhere. They do get a special provision where they're allowed to fly in and out of Tel Aviv when they leave the country. So they get a little bit of a better situation than those carrying the green identification. But even American citizens who are Palestinian are treated with discrimination or this lack of freedom of movement, this lack of, this restriction. Even Americans are subjected to this when the Israelis find out that they're Palestinians trying to help build up the West Bank. So hopefully that, it is more complicated, like I said, but this was a general overview. Thank you so much for watching. Please subscribe and hit the bell. This is one of many that are going to be rolling out this week. Palestinian lives are in danger. Benjamin Netanyahu announced that he plans to annex the Jordan Valley this coming Wednesday. And that would cut the Palestinians off from their Jordanian border, the Jordan River, which is their water source, and also take about a third of their agricultural land. It is an illegal annexation. The world is against it. But when does that seem to matter, unfortunately, at times? So we are shedding light on what life is like as a Palestinian under occupation. Thank you for watching this series. Thank you for supporting the channel. All of the links to any of the videos that are connected to this series are going to be linked down below, so please be on the lookout. Thank you again for watching.